This week's college basketball AP poll was just released, and yet again we have a change at the number 1 spot in the rankings. And in today's video, we are going to be breaking down the AP top 25 rankings, starting at number 25 and going all the way to the current number 1 team in college basketball. But before we get into the week 3 AP poll, if you enjoy the content, please consider dropping a like on the video and subscribing to the channel. And now, let's jump into it. And as always, before we get into the actual AP Top 25 poll, I want to quickly go over some of the other teams that are receiving votes and just missed out on the rankings. And to start us off, we have San Diego State, who comes in as the first team outside of the top 25. And the Aztecs are just 2-0 on the season, but have dominant wins over Long Beach State and Idaho State, and they are gearing up to face their first real opponents next week at the Players Era Festival. And I had San Diego State in my preseason top 25, so I'm expecting they will jump into the rankings here in the next few weeks. Next is Indiana, who I had mentioned in last week's video, but they keep receiving more and more votes to get into the top 25, and rightfully so. Darian DeVries now has the Hoosiers at 4-0 to start the year with a big win over Marquette, and Lamar Wilkerson and Tucker DeVries have been amazing so far on the offensive end, and this is looking like a team that could get Indiana back into the national conversation. Another team I had mentioned last week is Georgetown, and Ed Cooley and the Hoyas already have 2 wins against Power Conference teams this season in Maryland and Clemson. KJ Lewis and Malik Mack could be one of the best guard duos in the Big East this season, and it's looking like this could be the year that Georgetown is back in the NCAA tournament. But starting off the AP poll rankings at number 25 is NC State, who is ranked for the first time this season under new head coach Will Wade, and the Wolfpack have been absolutely dominant so far to start the year. NC State is 3-0 and have won by an average of 39 points in their first 3 games, and as expected, transfer Darion Williams has been leading the way for the Wolfpack, averaging 21.5 points per game, along with 6 rebounds and nearly 5 assists. But the biggest surprise has to be the emergence of Paul McNeil Jr., who is also averaging over 20 points per game, and although they haven't played the toughest competition yet, it's been a strong start for NC State so far this season, and it makes sense to me why they're in the top 25 now. Kansas actually moved up 1 spot to number 24 in the rankings and are now 3-1 on the season after a week where they beat both Texas A&M, Corpus Christi, and Princeton without their star freshman Darren Peterson. And Bill Self recently mentioned that Peterson will be out for the immediate future due to a hamstring injury, which is not good news for the Jayhawks squad that is scheduled to face a top 5 ranked team in Duke at the Champions Classic this week. And this team needs Darren Peterson to be healthy in order to compete with some of the higher level competition that they are set to face in their non-conference schedule like Duke, UConn, and NC State, and if he's not back soon, they could drop out of the rankings quickly. Wisconsin also moved up 1 spot in this week's rankings and are now at number 23, and the Badgers are another team that are undefeated but have yet to face a real test this season. But this will change later this week when they take on AJ Dubbanza and BYU. But in each of their first 3 games, Wisconsin has had a different leading scorer and has a lot of different weapons that they can go to. John Blackwell is definitely the team's best player, but Nolan Winter is the one who has impressed me the most so far and is averaging nearly a double-double on the season. And although I would have the Badgers just outside of the top 25, we'll see soon enough exactly what they're made of. Staying put at number 22 is Auburn, despite their loss to Houston this past weekend, but if you watch the game, you know it went down to the wire, and Auburn had multiple chances to win at the end, but ended up losing by 1 point to the Cougars. And although it was a loss, I was extremely impressed that Auburn was in this game the entire time, despite Tahad Pettiford struggling yet again. And it's been transfer Keyshawn Hall that has led the way for the Tigers so far, and he had 20 points and 11 rebounds against Houston before leaving the game late with an ankle injury, and they'll need him to stay healthy for the Players Era Festival later this week if they want to stay at or move up from this spot. Coming in at number 21 is the Arkansas Razorbacks, who also stay put in the rankings after dropping 7 spots last week, but Arkansas had a huge 37-point win over Central Arkansas this past week, but then struggled against a scrappy Samford team where they won 79-74. And the freshman duo of Darius Acuff Jr. and Malik Thomas have continued to impress, but Arkansas needs some of their older role players to be more consistent, and I was high on Carter Knox entering the season, but I would like to see him be a little more aggressive on the offensive end, and I truly believe when he is an active part of the offense that Arkansas has one of the higher ceilings in the country. Tennessee didn't move either and is ranked at number 20 in this week's AP poll, but they have continued to handle their business against lesser opponents and are 3-0 to start the year. And I actually would have the Volunteers a few spots higher in my rankings with how solid they have looked and the fact that they haven't struggled seemingly at all. Five-star freshman Nate Emmett has played well so far this season and is leading the team in scoring and rebounding, averaging 20 points and nearly 9 rebounds per game, but it will still be a little over a week before the Volunteers get their first true challenge against Houston at the Players Era Festival. But one of the biggest fallers of the week was UCLA, who dropped 4 spots down to number 19 in the rankings after their close loss to Arizona. And I was already skeptical of the Bruins early on this season, especially with their defensive play, as their first few games were not the best showings, but they surprised me a lot in that game against Arizona. And even though they lost, it made me feel a lot better about what they can be this season. And I still don't think the Bruins have played their best basketball yet, so number 19 in the rankings at this point just makes sense to me. North Carolina comes in at number 18 after 2 double-digit wins this past week over Radford and NC Central, and Caleb Wilson continues to impress and look like one of the best freshmen in the entire country. And I would argue that North Carolina has one of the top 3 front courts in the nation, as it's not just Wilson, but also Henry Vasar, who has looked extremely impressive as well to start the year. But their backcourt took a big hit this past week, as senior guard Seth Trimble will be out for approximately a month or maybe even longer after suffering an injury in a weight room incident, and we'll have to see how that affects Carolina going forward. At number 17 is Michigan State, and the Spartans are 3-0 to start the season and coming off of a 79-60 win at home against San Jose State. And Michigan State has been extremely balanced on the offensive end this year and currently has 3 different players averaging over 10 points per game, but the Spartans still have to figure out how they're going to consistently score in the half court, especially against higher level opponents that they have upcoming on the schedule. But a team led by Tom Izzo shouldn't be fully counted out, and that was demonstrated in their win against Arkansas a few weeks ago. Iowa State surprisingly stayed put at number 16 in the rankings even after a big win over Mississippi State this past week, where they won by 16 points and forced 26 turnovers. And the Cyclones are now 3-0 on the season, and I'm starting to think that they might be one of the most underrated teams in the nation, as they should definitely be ranked higher than this. Iowa State is top 10 in a lot of the predictive metrics, and their big 3 of Taman Lipsey, Joshua Jefferson, and Milan Mankiewicz have been awesome to start the year, and as I mentioned last week, their depth could be a problem for teams later on this season. Another one of the biggest fallers in the AP poll was the Texas Tech Red Raiders, who lost a close one on the road to Illinois and won at home against Milwaukee all in this past week. In the loss to Illinois, JT Topham was phenomenal, finishing with 35 points and 11 rebounds, but his dynamic duo Christian Anderson struggled, and something that I've noticed about this team is that both Topham and Anderson seemingly have to perform well in order for them to compete and win in big games, which is somewhat of a concern for me. But the Red Raiders have a chance to bounce back in next week's rankings, as Texas Tech is headed to the Bahamas and will play Wake Forest and either Purdue or Memphis this upcoming week. Before the second consecutive week, St. John's drops in the AP poll as the Red Storm fell back in 1 spot in this week's update. After its loss against Alabama last week, the Johnnies were off for 7 days before returning to action against William & Mary this past weekend, and despite just a 5-point lead at halftime, the Red Storm won by 33 points after a huge second half performance. But again, my biggest takeaway for this Johnnies team is that they have to figure out their guards. In each of their first 3 games, they have had a different starting backcourt, and the team is struggling from 3-point range again, just like last season. And all of this has to be figured out pretty quick, as they have a matchup with Iowa State next week. At number 13 is the Gonzaga Bulldogs, who were one of the biggest winners this past week, jumping up 6 spots in the AP rankings after wins over Creighton and Arizona State. And honestly, I think Mark Few and the Zags could be ranked even higher than this. Gonzaga is currently ranked number 2 according to KenPom, and maybe the only team in the country with 3 wins over power conference opponents already. The Zags defense has been absolutely elite so far. They have one of the best frontcourt duos with Graham Ike and Braden Huff, and their guard play has been extremely solid. And this could be one of the best and deepest Gonzaga teams we've seen in recent years. The Kentucky Wildcats come in at number 12 and have officially fallen out of the top 10 after their loss on the road against their rival Louisville. And the Cardinals flat out outplayed Kentucky in the matchup, and it was a rough game overall for the Wildcats. But Mark Pope's squad got back on track later in the week with a 46-point win over Eastern Illinois. But my biggest concern for this team has to be the injuries, as Jaden Quayton still doesn't have a timetable for his return, and transfer guard Jalan Lowe re-injured his shoulder and looks doubtful for the next couple of games. But Kentucky has another opportunity to get a top 25 win in their matchup with Michigan State later this week at the Champions Classic. Alabama Bama also fell out of the top 10 and comes in at number 11 after their first loss of the season in a matchup at home against Purdue. And the glaring difference in the game was the rebounding margin and the pace of play, as the Crimson Tide were out-rebounded by 24 rebounds and Purdue forced Alabama to slow down and play at their pace. And also, this could have been LeBaron Philon's worst game of the year, as he finished with just 11 points on 36% shooting. And after playing St. John's and Purdue back-to-back, the schedule doesn't get any easier for Nate Oates and the Crimson Tide, as Illinois and Gonzaga are their next two matchups. Coming in at number 10 is the Florida Gators, who have won 3 consecutive games after their season-opening loss to Arizona. And the Gators have looked a lot better in their recent matchups, and especially their front court compared to that performance against the Wildcats. But I'm starting to have real concerns with their guard play and their perimeter shooting. Boogie Fland and Xavier Lee have been inconsistent to say the least, and the team as a whole is shooting just 23.5% from deep through the first 4 games of the season. But as long as someone from the guard room can step up each game, I'm not necessarily worried about them contending at the SEC, but I am on a national level, and I'd like to see more consistency from the guys that they brought in. BYU dropped back 2 spots after their 2-point loss to UConn over the weekend, and I'm glad they stayed in the top 10 actually, because to me they deserve it. This team went on the road and played against one of the best teams in the country and made them earn it in the final 5 minutes of the game, and BYU was even down 2 starters for a majority of the game, with Kennard Davis out and Keba Keita going down to injury early. And in the second half, AJ Dabansa flipped a switch and had one of his best performances of the season so far, scoring 21 of his 25 points, and was the catalyst for what would have been a remarkable comeback for the Cougars. And if BYU is able to get everyone back and healthy, I think this Cougars team is still in great shape. At number 8 is Illinois, and Brad Underwood's squad was one of the biggest winners of the past week. The Fighting Illini defeated Texas Tech 81-77 last week behind a huge performance from transfer Andreas Stojakovic, who finished with a team-high 23 points and was impressive in the win. And Illinois followed it up later in the week with a double-digit win over Colgate, and David Murkovich was a beast in that one, and this has pushed them to 4-0 on the year. And this team has looked like one of the most complete and deep teams in the country so far this season, and we will see them in another ranked matchup against Alabama later in the week. Michigan comes in ranked at number 7 and dropped back 1 spot after back-to-back close games against teams that they definitely should have beaten by more. And early last week, the Wolverines found themselves going to overtime against Wake Forest, where they ended up winning 85-84 thanks to Elliot Cadeau's go-ahead free throw late in the game. And later in the week, Michigan won by 4 points on the road against a struggling TCU squad, and Michigan's turnover issues are starting to present a real problem for the Wolverines and are one of my biggest concerns for this team. But I'm also not loving the way they are utilizing Yaxel Lindenborg so far. I feel like he could be more effective with the ball in his hands more, and it's something I'd like to see. But at number 6 is my biggest winner of the week, and that's the Louisville Cardinals, who went 2-0 last week and beat their rival, the Kentucky Wildcats. And the Louisville backcourt has looked like and been the best backcourt in the country so far to me, and freshman point guard Michael Brown Jr. was named the ACC co-player and co-rookie of the week after averaging 24 points and 6 assists over Louisville's 2 wins. And this team has been so impressive, and when their offense gets going, I'm not sure there are many teams that can keep up in the nation, and my biggest questions have been their front court and the defense, but with what I've seen so far, Louisville looks like a real contender to win it all this year. Ranked at number 5 is the Duke Blue Devils, who fell back 1 spot in the rankings but had another 2-0 week after back-to-back 30-plus point wins. And for Duke, this week was all about Cameron Boozer, who had a historic performance against Indiana State, finishing with 35 points, 12 rebounds, 5 assists, 3 blocks, and 3 steals on 13 of 16 shooting from the field. And this Duke team just keeps looking better and better with each and every performance, and we'll get to see them in a top 25 matchup against Kansas at the Champions Classic this week. Cats are now 4-0 on the season and already have 2 ranked wins and have arguably that comes in at number 3 in the AP poll, but the Huskies also received 2 first place votes this week, and UConn had a big win over the weekend against AJ Dabansa and BYU with 3 different different Huskies scoring more than 20 points in the game, as Alex Caravan, Taurus Reed, and Silas Demery all had 21. And for all of their other games so far, the Huskies have been absolutely dominant, but this started a tough road test with UConn facing off against Arizona and then Illinois and Kansas in the next few weeks. But if the Huskies can come out of that undefeated, they should find themselves at the top spot. The Houston Cougars slid back to the number 2 spot, which is where they were to start the preseason after their win against Oakland and then their 1-point win over Auburn on Sunday. And although I think they should be at the number 2 spot, I don't think they have necessarily been as dominant as most would have expected so far this season. However, Kelvin Sampson and the Cougars do have 2 freshmen who have been absolutely lighting it up that I have to mention in Kingston Flemings and Kristanak Jr. And Kristanak was the higher rated of the two and is almost averaging a double-double and has been great, but it's been Kingston Flemings for me who has impressed the most, as the 6'4" guard is leading the Cougars in scoring and assists and was a big reason why they actually ended up winning against Auburn. But coming in at the number 1 spot is the Purdue Boilermakers, who moved back to the top-ranked team after their win on the road at Alabama. And with Trey Kaufman Wren back in the lineup, Purdue looked every bit like the number 1 team in the nation, as TKR had a huge game against the Crimson Tide and finished with 19 points and 11 rebounds. But the star of the game was the preseason National Player of the Year, Braden Smith, as he took over down the stretch and scored 29 points and was getting whatever shot or pass he wanted. And the Boilermakers also followed it up with a win over Akron at home before they're heading to the Bahamas this week for the Baja Mar Championship. And to me, Purdue is firmly the number 1 team in the nation right now, especially with a healthy Trey Kaufman Wren. But that wraps it up for today's video. Let me know your thoughts on this week's AP Top 25 rankings in the comments down below, and make sure and stay tuned for my own rankings that will be coming out this weekend. Also, if you enjoyed the content, don't forget to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.